Well, hello, my friends of the gathering. I hope you're doing well. Pastor Bob coming to you in another week of our Genesis study this summer. Man, Pastor Ryan did a great job walking through a huge part of our story as we're jumping back into Genesis. We've just covered Jacob and Esau being born, and now we're going to jump into the next patriarch of our story, that bridge between Isaac and Jacob. So we have a lot to cover. I'm just going to jump right into it this week and pray and get us going, okay? Let's pray. Gracious Father, thank you so much for the opportunity we have together to come through the internet, to grow together, to learn together, to just, God, to engage you together. So, Father, we love you. We praise you. We are so grateful for you. And I just, Lord, want to lift up all the folks watching this lesson, whether it's 1 or it's 50. We know that your word will never return void, Father. So help us all to get closer to you. Holy Spirit, guide us and lead us in this time and show us what you want. For me, I pray, Spirit, that you be with me in my teaching, that please yield my tongue from anything that is not in your word, from what you don't share, and correct me where needed and rebuke me where needed as well. We love you so much, Father. We praise you. We thank you in this crazy time that we live in. May we just get closer to you through your word in our time together. I ask all this in the loving name of Jesus. Amen. All right, folks. Well, let me get my screen share set up here. Go right over here. All right. Okay, and we will get ourselves going here and get ourselves started. Well, it is wonderful to have you. I'm very excited to jump into our lesson this week as we dive into Genesis chapters 27 through 29. So we have quite a little bit of ground to cover. Again, we are in our gathering series. Thank you to the leadership team for allowing Pastor Ryan and I to teach. We're so grateful for the opportunity at this point. I'm just going to kind of go past our introductions and zoom right into our lessons for the evening. For the time, and that is going to be, again, Jacob taking the blessing, Genesis 27 through 29. Now, how this fits into our overall theme is this: God's promise, but not just God's promise about faith through families. So we've covered all the way back to Abraham and moved forward in our time together, discussing how God gave a very distinct promise to the people of Israel, to us, to humanity, through Abraham and his bloodline. Now, as we go over Pastor Ryan's session last week, we do have to look at 24 through 26 in light of 27 through 29. It's very important. And so first, we know that he covered a wife for Isaac, the great story of Isaac getting his wife sent by Abraham, a servant, to that story. But then the sad death of Abraham, the end of the first patriarch of the Abrahamic family of that line. The beautiful story of Jacob and Esau, the wonderful battle that we'll see culminate even more today in our lesson between the two brothers, the two twins, and then Isaac and God's promise, that promise from Abraham then given to Isaac in that beautiful lesson, and then Isaac and Abimelech, that interesting story that we run across there in the unique aspect of his engagement in Canaan in that local region, hugely important. Now, we're going to focus on this family, and I think it's important to take a look at this family tree because that's what we're talking through. And that is here, you have this huge line of Abraham. Again, well, starting at Terah, technically, and then Abraham right up here. And then you have Sarah, and then down to Isaac. Well, we're going to pick up now with Isaac and Rebekah and their love story as it trickled down to their kids, their two boys. You'll see boys are in green, girls are in yellow, with Esau and Jacob. So that's an extended view of the overall family. Now, in terms of the biblical story, which we have to take a look at overall, we have covered up to this point a little bit under 2,000 years of history from the beginning of creation in our Genesis story. So I always like, again, timelines are important to see where we're at in the overall narrative. And beauty is we have a lot of ways to go with Genesis and also a lot of ways to go with Scripture. So there's always more to learn in this biblical story. Now, again, the setting, Isaac's life and his travels. We're picking up with Isaac, so we need to take a look at him and where he was at. Well, you can see him traveling basically throughout the whole region, going from that Hebron, where is pretty much Abraham landed, but then traveling to see his wife up in Haran with the servant when a wife was found, and then her brought down, and then him traveling up and down this region, and then also then to bury his father in the family burial plot there. But again, you see he did travel well, and he did get around, but mostly stayed there in the southern region of the Canaan area, down to where obviously modern-day Israel is in that region, but even a little bit of dip of the toes towards Egypt in that regards as well. But those are his lives and his travels, and that's what we're going to pick up. Now, before I jump into our text for our time together, it is important to recognize that Genesis, the portion of Genesis that we're going to cover, is pretty unique. It's a story made of many stories. So in the past, I like to teach in these kind of concrete sections. It's just how my mind works and how I've been taught. But in this case, we're actually going to dive into these little snippets of stories throughout an overarching narrative. So I can't really break down the text book by book or chapter by chapter. I have to break it down story by story. But I'll do the best I can to stay with what we've covered. So let's take a look at our outline for our first section. And again, we have to go back a couple verses into chapter 26, because that's where the story really begins. And it's going to carry us all the way through to chapter 28. So we see these episodes, for lack of a better phrase, these stories that occur throughout the large narrative between chapters 26 and 28, where we see that Esau marries the Hittite women in verses 26, 34 through 35, and then Isaac instructs Esau to prepare to be blessed. Rebekah instructs Jacob to acquire blessing. Isaac blesses Jacob. Esau appeals to Isaac for blessing, but then Rebekah thwarts Esau's revenge, and Jacob was sent away, and then Esau marries an Ishmaelite at the end of this cap. Now, what's really intriguing is this section could also be broken down into 3 additional sections, which I'll do, mainly for the sake of perspective. And it's that verses chapter 27, 41 through chapter 28, verse 5, where really there's these 3 different mini episodes, or these mini scenes, that all involve different parts of Isaac's family. So the first section is Rebekah and Jacob. Then you have Rebekah and Isaac, but then you have this interaction between Isaac and Jacob. And then that moves on into Esau and his marrying of the Ishmaelite woman. But it's important to break it down that way because it does give us perspective on how this episode plays out and how the story plays out moving forward in the history of Jacob that Pastor Ryan's going to cover next week. So why don't we get started here with our teaching? And that, of course, brings us to Jacob being blessed, that notorious story of him deceiving his father, of him getting Esau's blessing. If you recall from what Pastor Ryan covered, Jacob, was already able to take the birthright from Esau because of Esau's hunger. And Jacob's a little bit of a deceiver here, which we're going to see play out even more. But I want you to pay attention to who's behind him, Rebekah, his mother, because she's not so innocent. Frankly, none of them are innocent in this story. Neither are we if we had a Bible story written about us. But these characters are very intriguing into how they play in different ways to this story. So let's get going with our first episode here, and that is when Esau marries the Hittite women, all right? So when Esau was 40 years old, he took Judith, the daughter of Beri, the Hittite, to be his wife, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon, the Hittite, and they made life bitter for Isaac and Rebekah. So we start this chapter again in 26 because it sets up the story for the family tension as these boys have grown, Esau and Jacob, to adulthood. And so when we see this Hebrew structure, time was Esau's age, where it says was 40 years old in the yellow there, that shows us that it's a new development in the story. It's an acceleration of the story we just covered. It's the beginning of the warring of the twins story, right? The war between of Jacob and Esau. Now, Esau married at the same age as Isaac, which was in Genesis 25:20. We saw that he also married at 40 years old. But unlike Isaac marrying from Abraham's bloodline, he actually marries 2 Hittite women, a subgroup of the Canaanites. Now, while this is a mostly biographical point, it shows that Esau didn't really have a regard for Abraham's principle or even for Isaac's principle that was passed down to the family. If we remember when Isaac got married, what Pastor Ryan covered, it was very important that Isaac was to marry someone from Abraham's family. He was not to marry a Canaanite. That was very specific. So in this case, we see 2 things kind of occur. Well, we see that, one, Esau really had a disregard for this family lesson that would have been passed down. But we also see that Isaac was passive in his allowing of Esau to marry these 2 women. Isaac would have had, as the patriarch of the family in that time period, a right and the ability to step in between this marriage and make sure that it didn't occur. But he had this passivity towards even the principle passed down from his father for his sons about who they were allowed to marry. So we can kind of infer that Isaac really didn't care as he let Esau marry these women, but also Esau didn't really care about his father's wishes, even if he did. Now, while the answer isn't really discovered in the text, and I'm not going to try to bring more out of the text than we should, we can simply discern that Esau's indifference to Abraham's demands that someone from his bloodline doesn't marry a Canaanite It suggests that he perhaps doesn't really deserve to inherit Abraham's blessing. Remember, the author might be giving a little bit of an inference about what is coming down the line. Now, there's that interesting portion in verse 35 where it says, they made life bitter for Isaac and Rebekah, these Hittite women. Well, because Esau married Hittites, Isaac and Rebekah would experience an intense anguish for what he did. It would have brought shame onto their family. Now, we don't know exactly what these women did to torment them, but we can see that Isaac's indifference and Esau's choice had some serious ramifications as it brought some type of frustration on the family that made it very difficult. It bereaved them. It brought a bitter life for them. I would also guess, and this is my guess, my interpretation, I wouldn't choose to do what you want here, but also Rebekah being from the natural side of the family back in Haran, which we'll talk about a little bit later, she would have also known the bitterness of this situation and what this would have brought on the family. So it starts off with tension. That's the most important thing to point out in this story, in this narrative, is this thing goes right away to be a tensious setting. Well, then we go to our next chapter, which is Isaac instructing Esau to prepare to be blessed. This opening scene begins with Isaac and Esau alone. There's nobody else in this except with Rebekah listening in the wings, but she's not actually involved in any of the dialogue. The key point to remember is that this references an old and blessed scenario. It's echoing the previous deathbed scene in Genesis with Abraham when he sent a servant to find a non-Canaanite wife for Isaac. It's meant to be this interaction between father and son. But this time, unlike Abraham, it's not going to be something that's going to honor God or honor the family line of what it was called to. So when Isaac was old and his eyes were dim so that he could not see, he called Esau his older son and said to him, "My son." And he answered, "Here I am." He said, "Behold, I am old. I do not know the day of my death. Now then, take your weapons, your quiver and your bow, and go out to the field and hunt game for me, and prepare for me delicious food such as I love, and bring it to me so that I may eat, that my soul may bless you before I die." Now, Isaac was so old that his eyesight was poor and failing. He was at the end of his life. Now, this is inserted early to explain why Isaac wouldn't have been able to visually discern Esau from Jacob later. So we have to remember this fact. But we also know that in the rest of the Old Testament, we see that it was very common for an old man to gather his family for public blessings upon his deathbed. So the point was to show a clear succession of the family patriarch. This wasn't an abnormal setting. But what was abnormal was that we see that Isaac only summoned one child and not the whole family. He only summoned Esau. And so we have to ask the question, well, why did he do this? Well, as we'll see, both Esau and Jacob would have been entitled to some sort of blessing according to Old Testament practice, even up till then. Even in that culture, that was common. Now, the firstborn, the son, Esau, would have been given rule of the family, but again, a blessing, a sub-blessing would have been set aside for the rest of Abraham's or Isaac's children. We saw that with Abraham. We even saw that with with Noah. And we see that through the other characters in the Bible. So it's very important to notice that this isn't the case. He summoned just Esau to the moment. Now, it's especially peculiar because of Esau's decision to marry Hittite women that brought grief upon the family. So we can look at this a little bit and realize that Isaac's affirmed love of Esau, which was shared earlier in Scripture when Pastor Ryan taught on that, leads over here that even with Esau's infirmities, the things that he did wrong for the family, Isaac had a truer love for Esau than he did of Jacob. Now, we also know that Rebekah, had a bigger heart for Jacob. So that'll come into play here in a minute. But we see this very peculiar move by Isaac. So he knows that death is coming, and he's quickly trying to address this blessing to his family. But what he's trying to do is make sure that in the end of here, Esau is the only one that gets the blessing. Whether he doesn't know exactly when he's going to die or if he knows that it's coming up quickly, he has a sense of urgency where he wants Esau alone to have the full blessing of his family. It really is this interesting passive trait of Isaac that pops up that shows that his intentions aren't always right. In this case, they're pretty poor. He clearly wants to bless Esau and give Jacob nothing. Everything he's doing is outside of the deathbed customs before him, which makes this story so unique. So people hearing this back then, or even today, would go, well, wait a minute, what about the other boy? What about the rest of his family? Well, he's being purposely left out of the narrative, which is very important for us to latch on to. However, while even in haste, Isaac asks Esau to go make him food for his blessing to come about. Now, we might want to say, hey, That must be tied to some type of sacrifice or some love for the father. But when we unpack the Hebrew here, which I'm not going to go too in depth on, what we really discover is that his focus was really on the food. He had a worldly pleasure. He wanted to eat something yummy. He wanted a special moment with his son, which is, again, a good thing. But his focus really wasn't on the act of the blessing, it was the act of physical pleasure. So we see in verse 4 that Isaac's desire was to bless Esau from the depths of his soul in this attitude. So he was having a good attitude, but it was something that was more about physical pleasure and then doing what he wants rather than the right thing. It was more of a selfish desire by Isaac, which is giving perspective to this text. What also needs to be mentioned here is that this was another departure from the act of blessing sons in Old Testament history. In Old Testament, prior to this, it was simply stated that a blessing was given. Here we see this intentional addition of my soul, so that my soul may bless you before I die. It was this deep intention that Isaac was sharing, that he wanted to bless Isaac from the depths of his heart, that it was his desire, not just a blessing that he was passing on. Again, he is very much willing to overlook Esau's misdemeanors and bless him solely on his own. And Isaac's will is pitted against God and Rebekah's. That's really what's important, because he's throwing out completely his one son, but on top of that, he's making the blessing God gave his family about him and not about God, to be passed down fairly in the blessing system that God has shown in his father, but also in the families that existed before Abraham. So we continue on. Now, Rebekah was listening when Isaac spoke to his son Esau. And so when Esau went to the field to hunt for the game and bring it, we got to stop here because, one, we see that Rebekah was listening in the wings, and he caught Isaac in the act of deception. So she heard her husband saying, look, I want to bless you, son, only you. I've got everything I want to give you. Everything is yours. And she waited until Esau left to procure these blessings, which we're going to see, all right? So she was a little bit deceptive of herself, because her most beloved son was Jacob. That was in Genesis 25:28. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. They had two hearts for very different children, which is going to play out here in this interesting war between the twins. Well, that brings us into Rebekah's instruction of Jacob to acquire blessing. We remember from her youth that energy and decisiveness characterized Rebekah in her youth. Well, these traits pop up again now as she wants her son Jacob to be blessed. Now, she may have been angered by Isaac's actions because he tried to do something outside of her or outside of the family, which may explain her reaction. But the narrator does not tell us whether this was right or wrong. However, he does leave some clues to his thoughts in this matter that we're going to go through right now. Verse 6, Rebekah said to her son Jacob, I heard your father speak to your brother Esau. Bring me game and prepare for me delicious food, that I may eat it and bless you before the Lord before I die. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice as I command you. Go to the flock and bring me 2 good young goats, so that I may prepare from them delicious food for your father, such as he loves. Now note here that Jacob is called her son, while Esau prior was called his son in connection to Isaac. So Isaac was claiming ownership of Esau, versus here, Rebekah is claiming ownership of Jacob. It's not my sons, plural, it is his or her, right? So there's this divisiveness. It's another subtle reminder of the rift in this family. Now we also notice that Rebekah changed what Isaac said to Esau. She completely downplayed his desire to bless Esau. She admitted his desire to bless him from the soul. That's what she left out. She also seems to be persuading Jacob to take action, showing that he may have needed some motivation. We already know a little bit about Jacob's character, that he's a little wishy-washy. He was a thief, essentially, one who clings to the heel. He was a liar. And so he wasn't as strong, and he might have needed some motivation. This would make sense, again, based on what we know of him already. But Rebekah, regardless, begins to reveal her plan to Jacob, starting from her husband's own passion for food. So she knew what was going to please him, so that's what she was going to speak into. And she does this very interesting thing where you see here in the purple. It's very unusual because she commands Jacob to do something. Now, this term for command that's been used it's actually never tied to a feminine subject throughout the rest of the Old Testament. So it is a female using her maternal authority to muster up a command to her son to go do something, to carry out a scheme. Rebekah is working from a position that, looking at the rest of the Old Testament, she does not have authority to do so. But she is striving from every single thing that she is to connect to Jacob, to get him to obey her and to do something that she wants him to do. This is hugely important because she is exerting all her maternal authority and will to get him to do something. We also know that Jacob is wishy-washy with it. Again, he kind of hears it out because in the next section, it starts to play out more. She says, "You shall bring it to your father to eat, so that he may bless you before he dies." But Jacob said to Rebekah, his mother, "Behold, my brother Esau is a hairy man, and I am a smooth man. Perhaps my father will feel me, and I shall seem to be mocking him and bring a curse upon myself and not a blessing." His mother said to him, "Let your curse be on me, my son. Only obey my voice and go, bring them to me." So while Isaac asks Esau to prepare the stew, here we see that Rebekah actually does all the work and only asks Jacob to deliver the goods. We have to ask ourselves, did her actions again show her view of her son's abilities and character? Did she not believe in him? Did she not believe that he could do it? Or was he simply just not fully bought onto this yet? Regardless, it seems that Jacob was seen as this potentially incompetent person, or at least someone who needed a mama to take care of all the things for him, and that even someone who loved him the most didn't feel like he could fulfill the duties that the older brother could do. She didn't ask him to go hunt. She didn't ask him to make food. She said, "Son, I'll do everything for you, and you're going to do it." On a much, much less important example, I kind of think of the parent who does the kid's science project. The kid brings the project to the school. The teacher says, "This looks wonderful. Tell me about it." And the kid has no idea what it is because mom and dad made it the night before for him, and they have no clue what to do with it, right? Well, it's the same kind of thing. She has little faith in her son to get something done. Her goal, though, is clearly stated, that Jacob would receive the blessing of Isaac in Esau's place. That is clearly what she wants. She wants the blessing, or she wants him to have the blessing. But what about these questions, these kind of objections that Jacob puts forth? He has questions about his mother's plan, and he was deciding whether to follow it or not. But instead of being concerned with the authority of his father's wisdom, which would have been normal at that time in ancient Near Eastern culture, he would have gone to his dad first and said, "What do you want me to do?" He would have gone to Isaac. He just kind of glosses over it, and he simply worries about being caught. He doesn't really care about the morals of the situation. He cares about his own head. I mean, again, if you think about this, he even points out his own, the mockery that comes from this and the curse that come upon him. Jacob risks mocking a blind man, his own father, and gaining a curse on his head if he's caught. He's really worried about himself. Either way, though, it seems that Jacob is agreeing to his mother's counsel, even in stating his concerns, because he doesn't tell her no. He's hearing her out and trying to figure out, well, how does this play out? Rebekah's reply to this, though, is remarkable. She admits that Jacob could be cursed by Isaac and that the risk is real. However, it is worth it, and she will carry the curse for him. Now, what's interesting here in the text, we see later that a blessing cannot be transferred. And that means a curse couldn't be transferred either. You can't take a blessing away and give to somebody else, nor a curse. So Rebekah seems to recognize this, but her intense desire for Jacob to be blessed overpowers this fact. She wants her will to be done in this situation, much like Isaac, which is kind of ironic. And Rebekah's response shows her impatience and frustration with Jacob, wanting him to obey her because she gets more, again, aggressive in her commands versus asking him to do something. Verse 14, so he went and took them and brought them to his mother, and his mother prepared delicious food such as his father loved. Then Rebekah took the best garments of Esau, her older son, which were with her in the house, and put them on Jacob, her younger son, and the skins of the young goats she put on his hands and on the smooth part of his neck. And she put the delicious food and the bread which she had prepared into the hands of her son Jacob. So Jacob submits to his mom and follows through on the mother's orders. Now again, he doesn't do anything. She prepares it all. We notice that everything here was done by Rebekah, and Jacob just kind of sat there and did nothing. She even prepared a deceptive costume for Jacob to answer some of his worries about the furriness of his brother. Now, this also could show Jacob's apprehension. However, he's really not off the hooks. His relationship with his mother is mentioned in the midst of this story, which means he's tied to it. We see that there, such as his father loved. He was involved in this process, at least from allowing it to occur. And just because Jacob was mostly passive, it does not mean he was innocent in any way. So in looking at the goat skin, because we have to talk about this because it comes up later, one may wonder, well, how would Isaac have been fooled by this act, right? Well, what we already know is that his eyes were failing. We know that he was exceptionally old, and this was a testament to the quickly declining health of Isaac. So it's very possible that not only were the eyes a problem, but also his age, but his other senses of touch could be fading. He could have been frail, not been able to move well. He might have needed the assistance of a family member to move around. Think about visiting a loved one at a hospital who's approaching their deathbed. It's very difficult for them to get around and move around. Well, this could be occurring here. So it's as much as a case where you could pity Isaac, but remember he is going to be blamed here in a little bit too later, but also from what we've covered also, where again, he was trying to purposely cut his son out of the blessing, which was against family culture. So then we have the actual act of Isaac blessing Jacob. So he went into his father and said, "My father," and he said, "Here I am." "Who are you, my son?" Jacob said to his father, "I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done as you told me. Now sit up and eat of my game, that your soul may bless me." But Isaac said to his son, "How is it that you have found it so quickly, my son?" He answered, "Because the Lord your God granted me success." Now, Jacob now is fully committed to his mom's plan, and now he is engaging the deceptive act. Upon arrival, he immediately announces himself, but very timidly. Notice his words are very short. He doesn't really want to get caught. We have to keep that in mind, so the less he can speak, the better. And Isaac's first response was one of suspicion. He knew his son's voice, and he knew that that was not Esau. And he wanted to be sure that whatever blessing he was going to put forth went to the son of his choice, not to Jacob or anybody else. Right away, Rebekah's plan is in doubt. But Jacob's response was to lie, and now he has full responsibility for whatever comes. He claimed that he was Esau. He claimed that he was the firstborn. Now, he could have just said, "No, Dad, it's me, Esau," but he had to assert his position also. It was an intentionally aggressive act done by him to say, "No, I am the one that you are going to bless." It wasn't passive at all. Some scholars may argue that it was a quick response, but really in the way this lands in the text, it shows that Jacob's desire was his father's blessing, one that came from his soul and inner desires. He wanted everything that he could get from his dad. Now, Isaac still discerned the identity of his visitor, started asking logical questions about the intricate task of hunting and gathering food. Why did you do it so quickly? How did you get the animal so fast? Man, you made the food so quick. That doesn't make sense. Well, Jacob takes a big step, and some will say it was because of defense. I don't take that point. I'll let you decide. But he uses the Lord as the example for why things were able to be done so quickly. Basically, he uses the Lord's name in vain in this section. Many scholars will argue that here he was deceptively using God's name to get off the hook. Some scholars will argue that Jacob simply needed a convincing answer or else he was going to be caught. But even though you could argue both sides, it's in my opinion that he did mean to be deceptive. So at the best case scenario, he was still using God's name to deceive Isaac. And either way, it was sin because God didn't do that. God didn't provide him this success in this narrative. He was trying to cover his own behind. So we see in verse 21 that Isaac said to Jacob, "Please come near me, or please come near that I may feel you, my son, to know whether you are really my son Esau or not." So Jacob went near to Isaac, his father, who felt him and said, "The voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau." And he did not recognize him because his hands were hairy like his brother Esau's hands. So he blessed him. Now the tone of the narrative now increases. It's kind of like a murder mystery that the tempo is increasing and getting faster and faster and faster. Isaac is now asking for physical proof. Will he be caught or not? Well, apparently the disguise made by Rebekah works. As while the voice of Jacob is confusing, the feel of his hands, that fur of the goat skin, right, was able to trick him enough where he was convinced that this most likely was Esau. Now, we'll see in a minute he's not completely convinced, but he is getting closer to deciding that, yes, this must be him. Now, we see right here at the end, Isaac commits to blessing Jacob, and will begin the ceremony of blessing him, which will culminate in verse 27. But he does say here, well, let's go ahead. We're going to start blessing you. It sounds like you're not Esau, but you feel like Esau, so I'm going to move forward in this process. Verse 24, he said, "Are you really my son Esau?" He answered, "I am." Then he said, "Bring it near to me, that I may eat of my son's game and bless you." So he brought it near to him, and he ate, and he brought him wine, and he drank. Then his father Isaac said to him, "Come near and kiss me, my son." Doubt still abounded in Isaac's mind. He still wasn't sure, and it gave Jacob one more chance to kind of come clean before the start of this ritual blessing, which would have locked in this blessing from his father. And here we see that Jacob certainly chose to lie and to deceive him again. So from here on out, this ritual begins. We see that the food was ate, that they enjoyed time together as a family. We see that the wine that was drank typically represents a celebration. So it was a good occasion for Isaac, and I guess for Jacob too, albeit in deception. And so this was meant to be a wonderful occasion. And it does end in one last confirmation of who the visitor was before the blessing when Isaac asked to kiss Esau, which would be Jacob. He wanted this one loving, tender illustration with him. Well, this begins our discussion on the blessing itself. So he came near and kissed him, and Isaac smelled the smell of his garments and blessed him and said, "See, the smell of my son is as the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed." Isaac has now used all his senses to confirm who this person was. Now, while his ears brought him caution, he did this best with all his other senses and felt this person was Esau. With no more questions or challenges, Isaac officially begins to bless Jacob. So this is poetic chiasm that we see here, and it shows textually that this is the blessing that he gave him. Isaac smelled him, he knew it was him, and so now he's confirming that, yes, this is my son, I confirm that it's him, this is the field of the Lord that has blessed me, this is from the blessing that God promised me, my kin, my child. May God give you of the dew of heaven and of the fatness of the earth and plenty of grain and wine. Here, quickly, Jacob has been given the blessing in the Lord. He's going to thrive and be blessed off the land. What he yields from the earth will be plentiful. Well, then here in verse 29 is the real huge part of the blessing. Let peoples serve you and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you. The phraseology here echoes the oracles in chapter 25, verse 23. Nations and brothers are linked by the word serve. So Esau and the nations will serve the family line of Jacob. The core blessing of Genesis as a whole is pointed out here. A blessing through one family, right? The promise of God. The whole reason, frankly, we're talking this summer is to highlight this point. The nations will be blessed by Jacob's line through Abraham, and those who curse him will be cursed. Now, this is as much less personally stated than in verse 12, chapter 12, verse 3, from God to Abraham. So one could safely assume that this is a little bit less intimately relationally connected. Obviously, Abraham was closer to God than, say, Isaac and Jacob. But we can see that this curse and this blessing does come back and forth based on what was promised to Abraham, and now it's been given through Isaac on to the next son, which is Jacob. So you have the blessing fully confirmed. Now, the blessing from God to Abraham, to Isaac, now to Jacob has been passed on completely in the official blessing. Well, Esau then comes back into the picture, and no matter what we want to say about Esau, I think we could have a little bit of sympathy and empathy for him because boy, oh boy, did he get the rough end of the stick here. We see that as soon as Isaac had finished blessing Jacob, when Jacob had scarcely gone out from the presence of Isaac his father, Esau his brother came in from his hunting. He also prepared delicious food and brought it to his father. And he said to his father, "Let my father arise and eat of his son's game, that you may bless me." His father Isaac said to him, "Who are you?" He answered, "I am your son, your firstborn, Esau." Well, here comes big brother. Jacob would exit just at the right time in this story. Esau was minutes, if not seconds, away from stopping the blessing, but it was just too late. No matter how long it took to make the food, no matter how long it took to catch the game, Esau was ready to receive his blessing with cheer, in good spirits, and he went into his father's tent or where he was staying to receive his blessing. And he was in a mood of expectation, but unfortunately, it doesn't go that way for him. Well, fortunately, unfortunately, in the grand scheme, very fortunately, because we know the story ends. But unfortunately for him, it was a very tragic moment. Sadly, Esau's joy is limited as his father confusingly asked who he was. So this was the first sense that something was wrong. It would have been quite alarming to Esau to hear this because, remember, the initial reaction between father and son, he sent him off to do all these things. And then he comes back and the father goes, "Well, who are you?" And, well, he answers just like Jacob did earlier with a very stern and aggressive answer, "I'm Esau, your firstborn son." He was stating who he was very directly in his lineage and connection to Isaac. He was troubled. He was bothered. He knew something was wrong here. Well, then Isaac trembled very violently and said, "Who was it then that hunted game and brought it to me? And I ate it all before you came, and I have blessed him." Yes, and he shall be blessed. As soon as Esau heard the words of his father, he cried out with an exceedingly great and bitter cry, and said to his father, Bless me, even me also, O my father. But he said, Your brother came deceitfully, and he has taken away your blessing. Isaac now panics. He is confused and angered about what had happened. The blessing of Esau has been given away completely. He says it very directly that his blessing has been given to this stranger. Isaac's extreme panic is matched, though, by his son Esau's extreme distress. When Esau finally answers his father, it's a real pathetic plea for his blessing to be given to him. But Isaac would answer his very own question now, knowing what had happened right there at the end. Your brother came deceitfully, and he has taken away your blessing. He is not able to bless Esau because Jacob came and stole that blessing from him. And there's this very sad moment that even with bad intentions from both parties, this robbery had occurred. Well, Esau said, Is he not rightly named Jacob? For he has cheated me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and behold, now he has taken away my blessing. Then he said, Have you not reserved a blessing for me? Isaac answered and said to Esau, Behold, I have made him lord over you, and all his brothers I have given to him for servants, and with grain and wine I have sustained him. What then can I do for you, my son? Esau is enraged at his brother for taking his blessing twice. First the birthright, then the blessing. Even if he was complicit in his acts, he was really the casualty of Jacob's selfishness. Now, he has been treated unfairly, and now he knows it fully. While Esau was imperfect, Jacob's acts was treacherous. And it just shows how bad Jacob really was. Now, as if grasping for straws, Esau asks again his father to give him a blessing, even the bottom of the barrel scrapings. But we have to remember that Isaac, in his intent, meant to give Esau the full blessing of his right, of his family. He didn't set anything aside. He meant to cut out Jacob and cut everybody else out. And we see that here where he says, I have nothing left for you. I gave him everything. I told him that his brothers were going to serve him. I even put it in stone when we had a meal and we celebrate with wine to sustain him. Jacob had left nothing. Isaac had left nothing for Esau. Isaac reaffirms this, that he gave everything to Jacob, and now Esau is hopelessly lost. Isaac has no answers for his son, his most beloved son. Well, Esau said to his father, Have you but one blessing, my father? Bless me, even me also, O my father. And Esau lifted up his voice and wept. Esau doesn't give up, and he desperately pleads for a blessing, sobbing in despair. Notice that begging of a son to a father. Please help me, Dad. Please. Is there no blessing left? This is the 3rd time now he's asked for that blessing, and it's gotten more desperate every single time. Well, Isaac really didn't have any words to say except one of gloom. He says, Behold, away from the fatness of the earth shall your dwelling be, and away from the dew of heaven on high. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. But when you grow restless, you shall break his yoke from your neck. Again, this is a tragic response, even though it has some blessings in it. Esau will thrive off the land and prosper just like Jacob, but all of it will be done under his brother's rule. Jacob has been given authority over his brother and over all their offspring that would come afterwards. And later we would see that Esau's descendants would live by the sword. The descendants of Esau would end up becoming Edom, the Edomites. And the Edomites would always have a tension with the Israelites. Now, there was a season when the Edomites were under rule by King David, and they lived peacefully. But later, when Jerusalem was to fall, Edom would get its revenge and kind of turn on Judah, essentially, and separate themselves and be harsh to their brothers in Judah. Now, this could be them breaking their yoke from your neck. I believe textually you could argue that it is a little bit of prophetic for the future. But we do see this tragic scene where no matter what, Esau is now at the bondage of his brother. And although there will be a time where he'll break his yoke from his neck, if you do tie it to that Edomite story, we also see through the prophets that it doesn't go very well for God's judgment on the Edomites. So it's very difficult and a very sad scenario that's going on here. Well, we're going to take a look at Esau's reaction, but basically we're going to look now into Rebekah's plan to thwart Esau's revenge and how Jacob gets sent away. Now, Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him, and Esau said to himself, "The days of mourning for my father are approaching. Then I will kill my brother Jacob." But the words of Esau, her older son, were told to Rebekah. So she sent and called Jacob, her younger son, and he said to him, "Behold, your brother Esau comforts himself about you by planning to kill you." Now, Jacob was now in the crosshairs of Esau. Esau's plan was to get revenge, and he was building this plan, and he was going to wait for his father to die, for Isaac to die. He was going to spend the time to mourn him, as we saw with Abraham, as we saw with other characters in the Bible. But then after that, he was going to kill Jacob. Now, he most likely was going to wait because he didn't want to bring any more pain to his father, and he loved him. So that's why it wasn't an immediate case. And he didn't want to probably stir up any initial trouble that would make his cause less beneficial for himself. Regardless, we saw that he said, "I'm going to wait, and then I'm going to act." Well, Esau must have spoken this out loud at some point or shared it with somebody else, because it did reach Rebekah. And in this Hebraic phraseology, we see an insinuation that Rebekah made this sound like an immediate action. She leaves out the post-death and mourning portion of Esau's committal. Her injunction to Jacob suggests that either she had received an inaccurate report of what Esau was saying, or that she put a slant on them in order to make Jacob act more promptly. Regardless, the exact words of Esau don't fully match here, and Rebekah wanted to address this issue. "Now therefore, my son, obey my voice. Rise, flee to Laban, my brother, in Haran, and stay with him a while, until your brother's fury turns away, until your brother's anger turns away from you, and he forgets what you have done to him. Then I will send and bring you from there. Why should I be bereft of you both in one day?" Well, notices again, she continues to command her son to do things. Jacob is still passive. Jacob is to flee, to run away, showing the dire situation. That's what she wants. And she wants to send him to her brother back in Haran. Now, as Jacob's uncle, this brother would be bound legally to protect him from harm. So she was looking out for his best interests, but she was trying to control the situation completely. In this section, Rebekah's fear does shine through. It's a very, very powerful plea from Rebekah, and she knows what will happen if it doesn't get addressed. However, between this part and the next part, we don't really see Jacob's response here. He doesn't really react or do anything. We don't know if he no longer trusts his mother, or if her character flaws have been pointed out and he doesn't really believe her story fully. Maybe he's afraid to leave, or maybe it's just his own character flaws, his own passivity, his own inability to act. The narrator doesn't really tell us, but we do see a solution here in the next section. Then Rebekah said to Isaac, "I loathe my life because of the Hittite women. If Jacob marries one of the Hittite women like these, one of the women of the land, what good will my life be to me?" Regardless of Jacob's response, Rebekah knows what she needs to do to get him to leave. And so she goes to her husband, to Isaac, the old man, to get him to go. Now notice she doesn't appeal to Isaac's love for Jacob, of which there really was little, especially after what just happened. She appeals to the cultural aspects of their marriage and the grief that was already brought upon them by Esau in marrying Hittite women. She's basically said to him, "Do you want to have this burden, this crushing brought on again, just like Esau did through Jacob? Do you want us to dilute our family line even more?" And so she was trying to appeal to these aspects of who Isaac was and the portions of his heart that would have mattered to him. So essentially, she stayed neutral on purpose to persuade her husband's favor towards Jacob once again. She was a very tricky lady and very creative. Well, again, this is what brings us into chapter 28 of Genesis, where Jacob begins this little bit of change. And again, it's just the very beginning of his change, but it's important to mention that this is where it started. Verse 1, we see, "Then Isaac called Jacob and blessed him and directed him. You must not take a wife from the Canaanite women. Arise, go to Paddan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and take as your wife from there one of the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother." Now Isaac responds favorably and summons Jacob, which I'm surprised after what just happened, but we don't see any kind of back and forth between him and his son. It's actually pretty cold when you really read it, which would make sense. But he does respond favorably to Rebekah's challenge and brings Jacob into his place to give him command and give him direction. He blesses Jacob again. We have to notice that. And he then tells him to go take a wife from the family line. But instead of sending a servant to find a wife like Abraham did for Isaac, Isaac is sending Jacob directly to find himself a wife. He's telling him to leave town. He's telling him to get out. Now, seeming to come from his wife's suggestions, he sends Jacob to Rebekah's family in Haran, which mirrors everything that Rebekah shared before to Jacob. So most likely, or at least closely, we can insinuate that Rebekah did provide a solution to Isaac, and Isaac listened and carried that forward. We also have to remember that at this time, we don't know that Esau wanted to cause any harm Isaac wouldn't have known that Esau wanted to cause harm on Jacob. We don't see, in these own words, we see that Esau didn't want his dad to know, and he didn't tell them. And from this text, we don't see that Isaac thinks Jacob is any type of danger. He just wants him to leave. We can also note that at no time did Isaac refer to Jacob as his son. The only relational connection is references to Rebekah as Jacob's mother. Basically, in a sad way, kind of this, hey, it's your mom, it's her family, go spend time with them. There was really this coldness between father and son in this situation. The only relational connection here is to mom, and it illustrates the known close relationship between Jacob and his mother, which is very important. So verse 3, God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and multiply you, that you may become a company of peoples. May he give the blessing of Abraham to you and to your offspring with you, that you may take possession of the land of your sojournings that God gave to Abraham. Thus Isaac sent Jacob away, and he went to Padan Aram to Laban, the son of Bethuel, the Aramean, the brother of Rebekah, Jacob's and Esau's mother. Again, what a mouthful there. But let me sum it up here for you. Pretty basic. This is the first time that Isaac fully describes Jacob's blessing as that of Abraham. It's the first time that Isaac is directly connecting Jacob to it in depth. So you do have this mirror. It's still a little bit diluted compared to the promise from God to Abraham that was mentioned earlier, and even the promise given to Isaac earlier. But we see that the promise was fully given. This is the promise of God given to Abraham, now given to Isaac, now given to Jacob. Now, in the past, Jacob had ignored his mother's warning and had to be sent away, but this time he obeys his father. We don't know whether he did it quickly or slowly. What matters is he just obeyed and he listened. Well, before we move on, we have this kind of one weird scene with Esau when he marries an Ishmaelite woman. Now, Esau saw that Isaac had blessed Jacob and sent him away to Padan Aram to take a wife from there. And that as he blessed him, he directed him, you must not take a wife from the Canaanite women. And that Jacob had obeyed his father and his mother and gone to Padan Aram. Now, Esau saw Jacob blessed, and yet again, and his revenge sent away to a land of protection. So he knew what was going on here, and so that frustrated him. But he saw the pleasure from his parents was found in Jacob marrying anyone but a Canaanite woman. It was very descriptive, do not marry a Canaanite woman, and now Esau heard this. Verse 8, so when Esau saw that the Canaanite women did not please Isaac his father, Esau went to Ishmael and took as his wife, besides the wives he had, Mahalath, the daughter of Ishmael, Abraham's son, the sister of Nebaioth. So now, realizing that his prior marital choices brought shame to his parents, he went to Abraham's other son, Ishmael, to find a pleasing wife. Esau seeks to make amends, basically, for his earlier actions of marrying those two Hittite women. To gain approval of his parents, he marries one of Abraham's son's daughters. However, he still retains Hittite wives. Now, it is important to mention that most likely Ishmael was dead at this point based on other Old Testament genealogies. But it could have also meant that he just went to Ishmael, the people of Ishmael, right, to marry someone in the family. But it also shows that there was this close connection between Isaac and Ishmael, that there was this close brotherly connection between the families, so that relationship still existed, which will give us a little bit of insight later. And also, too, I think it's quite important because it gives us a little insight to the family dynamics that were at play in the overall Abrahamic family line. Well, the next step of our story is Jacob's dream, that interesting story of a ladder. I wanted to give you this little depiction because we're going to unpack that a little bit before we move forward. But it's also the mark of a new story or a new section in our narrative for this lesson. And that's Jacob meeting God at Bethel, chapter 28, verses 10 through 22. So the first section is Jacob's experience at Bethel, then Jacob's first reaction at Bethel, and then Jacob's vow that came from that. Now here is Jacob's travels, traveling from Beersheba all the way up to Haran. So this is roughly the route he would have taken, specifically up through Bethel and through through that region. And so again, the geography changes a little bit, but now he's just heading north. What's important here to note is he's going away from his local community, his comfortable community, and moving towards a more a less familiar scenario, less familiar environment. Now, let's talk through Jacob's experience at Bethel, which is very important. It wasn't named Bethel yet, so let's start with that. But then we'll talk about how it was become to known that. So Jacob left Beersheba and went toward Haran, and he came to a certain place and stayed there that night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed, and behold, there was a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. So this section describes Jacob's journey to Haran, the very beginning of it. And along his journey, he found a place to rest after days of travel. It was nighttime and he was tired. And Jacob was now forced to sleep outside. Now, this may show that he was away from human habitation. He could have been hiding and in fear of those he didn't know. Maybe he was even afraid of his own brother's pursuit. Did Esau find out that he left? Was he trying to go a road less traveled so he couldn't be found? We're not sure, but in that time period, especially with a patriarch, when someone would leave, they usually would travel amongst people so they could have a place to stay, like someone's home or stay in an inn or something like that. But he chose to be in a place where those accommodations were available. Now, real quick to mention that stone, scholars will argue that the stone Jacob used could have also been an illustration for a hiding place. He could have made out of many stones. It would match the narrative, but either way, whether he just used the stone as a pillow or he built himself a mini fort to protect himself at nighttime, this did bring him some type of comfort, which is important. Now, I've highlighted for you also in yellow this repetition of place. It shows that this was a very unique location where something special was about to occur. The author very quickly is lining these up, the narrator is lining these up to get the reader to pay attention to what is going on here. So verse 12, as he rests overnight, Jacob has this dream which centers on this ladder set up on earth and the top of it reaching to heaven. Now, the Hebrew term translated ladder could possibly denote a stairway similar to those found in ziggurats. What matters most is not really the shape of the structure, but its purpose. It provides this bridge between heaven and earth, revealing that God is still committed to making earth his dwelling place. This is what a Mesopotamian ziggurat most likely would have looked like. And if you see these tiered steps, the whole point was that they believed that that upper chamber would have been a place between where the gods would have interacted between the heavenlies and the earthly. So this image that he had, or the image that could have been used in the narration here, may not literally have meant a ladder by our definition, like a step ladder. It could have also been the vision of a ziggurat, of angels coming up and down. What matters here is really the interaction that he saw between God and heaven, or excuse me, God and earth, between heaven and earth. This divine placement that God planned, that God had, this interaction he had, that God was really involved in the earthly things on this side of heaven. So verse 13, and behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. So God is standing now over Jacob and introduces himself divinely. This divine title appears nowhere else in the Old Testament. I highlighted it for you there in yellow. It shows that the promise given to Abraham was also given to his father Isaac, and it has now been given to Jacob. So God was now announcing himself as the Lord, but also the Lord of the promise that Jacob just received, that he was the one who gave this to them. And so from here on out, the divine promise given to Abraham is echoed in this narrative. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. In an act of grace, God states that he will not abandon Jacob, but will fulfill these promises to him that he just mentioned in the previous verses 13 through 14. In addition, God's going to bring Jacob back to the promised land with his existing extended family. So these promises came up. God stayed in the promise. He's blessed. He's showing that the blessing that he had been told about ever since he was a little boy was now his, and that God was going to be with him. Well, we have to take a look at Jacob's first reaction, because remember, this is not the Jacob who wrestled with God yet. This is the Jacob who just stole his stuff from his brother, the blessing from his brother. Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. Jacob wakes from the dream and has two reactions. First, his initial response was one of awe and wonder, but then the second one was of fear. When both emotions are combined, his reaction was one of worship and reverence. Using house of God gives allusion to what he was going to name that place, Bethel, here in a moment. But he did wake up realizing this was a very special divine moment that had just occurred. So he made a vow of this from his reaction. So early in the morning, Jacob took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up for a pillar and poured oil on the top of it. He called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of the city was Luz at the first. Now, to show piety, Jacob takes the stone he slept on and made a pillar to God and poured oil on it. serving as a reminder to what occurred here. He was setting up pretty much a memorial saying, God, this amazing event with God occurred here. Now, the city of Bethel would become the location of this, but in the 10th century, ironically and sadly, the Canaanites would use it as a heretical place where they honored other gods. Bethel would become very important in the biblical narrative. It's important today. But again, this is where it started. So at one point, Bethel was pure, but then it became sullied, but then it became pure again, and it'll be made pure again later in the second coming of Christ, which is important for us to note. But we won't get into that because we don't have time to get into that, but that's why it was mentioned. So then Jacob made a vow saying, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear so that I come again to my father's house of peace, then the Lord shall be my God. And the stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will give a full tenth to you. Jacob is still ambivalent to God's promise even after what just happened. Even after he met him, he still needed convincing. He had this if clause, right? If you give me what I need, and you give me the food, and you give me my way, and if you give me money, and if you give me the travel, and if you give me peace, then you'll be my God. This will require a further personal encounter before Jacob fully trusts in the Lord later in chapter 32, the wrestling of God, but Jacob just was not convinced. And again, if God does what Jacob wants, Jacob will respond through the sacrificing of his material items, which lays the foundation for a tithe. We'll see later, in centuries later, the Israelite worshipers would give a tenth of their income to God as an expression of their commitment to him. What's important here is that Jacob did not commit that. While he set up the precedent for it, he did not make that commitment. So now we shift over to Genesis 29 and start moving into our faster but also equally important story. And that's when Jacob starts his family, the beginning of this building up. And it starts out with three outlines here. One, when Jacob meets Laban in the well. So Jacob meets the shepherds of Haran, Jacob meets Rachel, and Jacob stays with Laban. Those are the three sections here. So let's look at the very first one. Then Jacob went on his journey and came to the land of the people of the east. As he looked, he saw a well in the field, and behold, 3 flocks of sheep lying beside it. For out of that well the flocks were watered. The stone of the well's mouth was large, and when all the flocks were gathered there, the shepherds would roll the stone for the mouth of the well and water the sheep, and put the stone back in its place over the mouth of the well. So this begins the story of Jacob's family. After finishing at Bethel, he gets up, he heads on the road, he gets to Haran to meet Laban, and the first encounter he had were people from the east, these nomadic Canaanite herders that would have come to this well, this very important place, to feed their sheep. And watching from a distance, Jacob observed what they were doing, these lush resources, and then the work they were putting forth. What's important, what we have to remember, is this large stone covering the well. This stone would have been put there to cover a very important precious resource, which is water, to these nomadic herders. But he was also observing how these guys did this and the time of day they did it. So this section here is very important because we have 4 questions that are going to pop up between this slide and the next slide, this conversation between Jacob and the shepherds. But let's dive into the text first. Jacob said to them, "My brothers, where do you come from?" They said, "We are from Haran." He said to them, "Do you know Laban, the son of Nahor?" They said, "We know him." He said to them, "Is it well with him?" They said, "It is well, and see, Rachel is his daughter, is coming with the sheep." He said, "Behold, it is still high day. It is not time for the livestock to be gathered together. Water the sheep and go, pasture them." Now, this section begins with this dialogue between Jacob and the shepherds. And to be honest with you, it starts off pretty cold. He comes down there and tries to be polite by saying, "My brothers," a very kind, polite interaction. But he slowly becomes impatient every time they answer a question. He asks them a question. They give a very quick response. He asks a question, quick response, question, quick response. Then on that third response, they try to kind of get him away from him, saying, "Look, here comes Rachel. Go talk to her." They were trying to get him away. He was trying to primarily he was primarily concerned with trying to connect with his uncle and to engage the family. And once they saw someone from her family, they were thinking, "Oh my goodness, thank you. Go talk to her. Get away from us." They wanted him away. Every answer he gained was short-tempered. Essentially, they were pretty much annoying him, and they wanted him away from them. They wanted him away from him. In his fourth question here in verse 7, in our text, it's not in the phrase of a question, but essentially what it's saying is a cocky way of saying, "Look, why don't you work this way?" Well, their response kind of set him off, and his response set the shepherds off, and they said basically, "We cannot until all the flocks are gathered together and the stone is rolled from the mouth of the well. Then we water the sheep." While he was still speaking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess. So Jacob's cockiness on their critiquing their work evidently annoyed the shepherds, how he asked and how he kind of gave a veiled compliment or an insult to them. They finally just wanted to get him away, and they gave him a deeper answer and fully shifted him off to Rachel. They couldn't water until all the flocks were present, and this put Jacob's future actions in perspective. So while they were waiting, Rachel comes with her flock to water the sheep. Right? It was her dad's sheep, not her sheep. We have to remember that's important too. Well, here's this interaction when Jacob meets Rachel. Now, as soon as Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, Jacob came near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and wept aloud, and Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's kinsman, and that he was Rebekah's son, and she ran and told her father. So this warm and calm response of Jacob to meeting Rachel is very different from his interaction with the shepherds. His enthusiasm here empowers him to move that large rock, that covering of the well, away on his own power to feed the sheep. Now again, this wasn't her sheep, it was her father's sheep. Jacob's actions here may seem odd, especially with the kissing, but his emotions were high. He was extremely excited to finally meet someone from his family. Now, we may want to put this into the context of Jacob and Rachel's love story, and really it probably can be considered part of the beginning of it, but this is more about his motivation about getting connected to his uncle and finding him. He was more excited about that than he was really meeting her. And he was overwhelmed by the family and the opportunities God had placed before him to connect with them. So this moment, while exciting and beautiful, was actually more about him connecting with his family than it was about him connecting with Rachel. That'll change, though, here pretty quickly. So Jacob now stays with his uncle, where we see as soon as Laban heard the news about Jacob, his sister's son, he ran to meet him and embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his house. And Jacob told him all these things. And Laban said to him, "Surely you're my bone and my flesh." And he stayed with him a month. Now when Laban hears of this, his emotional tone matched that of Jacob's as he ran to greet him. Patriarchs don't run in ancient Near Eastern cultures. That would not have been something that would have been acceptable. So he was excited to meet him. But after he hears of Jacob's story, he now fully is convinced that he is his nephew. And there was a warm embrace of the family that occurred here. But there is something unique that happens here in a second. And that involves his other daughter, Leah, right? So this next section, 29, 15 to 30, covers the betrothal of Jacob to Leah, 7 years of service to Rachel, the wedding itself, and then another 7 years of service. And the reason I kind of was a little bit sarcastic with Laban's background is because he wasn't fully an honest dude, and we're going to see that here. Then he said to Jacob, "Because you are my kinsman, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what shall your wages be?" Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were weak, but Rachel was beautiful in form and appearance. Jacob loved Rachel, and he said, "I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel." Now, this offer of work may seem kind in our context, but really it wasn't. What he had done there is he had actually diluted family ties to money and wages. Laban was not really super familial excited that Jacob was there. He was looking for opportunity. His heart is not as pure as the reader would think. It shows that it was more about the beginning of his story of exploiting Jacob than anything else. As we look at these words, serve and wages, he didn't see him as an equal, as a family member. He thought of him as someone, a slave, or someone who was going to be paid for his efforts. Now, we have this odd insertion of Leah, the story of Leah and her background, and it's important because it does place context for later, that the older sister was seen as less than in this culture. It can be assumed that Leah had less pleasing features than Rachel did, and possibly was less desirable in her personality. In ancient Near Eastern cultures, the oldest sister was usually married off first, which then would create a problem for her father. He saw that Jacob loved Rachel, but he had to find a husband for his wife, for his oldest daughter first. And so that's why he asked him to stay there and be with him. But in his haste, Jacob committed his love to Rachel and offered to give 7 years of service to marry her. Now, this showed the intensity of his love for her, and that was above and beyond the traditional bride price for marriage. But it was also more acceptable for him to offer service rather than money, because family, it could have been a shame issue. Either way, it bought Laban time. And we look at his response. He said, "Well, it is better that I give her to you than that I should give her to any other man. Stay with me." He gladly agrees to the offer. However, he cheats already. He doesn't mention who the her is. He could have been hoping for time to pass where someone would marry Leah prior to those 7 years being up so that Jacob could marry Rachel. But no matter what, we see that Laban does not commit fully to Rachel by name. He says it's better to marry her than I should give her to any other man. So he's not fully transparent here, which again might bring us back to the story of Isaac and Jacob in the blessing story, which we'll play here in a second. So 7 years of service occurred. Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of the love he had for her. Simply put, this is a fast forwarding of the narrative. Time has passed quickly for Jacob because he loves her deeply, and now he was ready to accept his bride at the wedding. So Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife that I may go into her, for my time is completed." So he gathered together all the people of the place and made a feast. But in the evening he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and he went into her. Laban gave his female servant Zilpah to his daughter Leah to be her servant. The wedding is not what Jacob seems. He eagerly wants to go into his bride. He wants to consummate the wedding. He wants to make her his wife. And so Laban puts on a big party, does everything normal. There's no way Jacob would think anything has gone awry. But unfortunately for Jacob, the lateness of the hour, the veiling of his bride, and maybe even too much wine allowed Laban to substitute the unloved Leah for the promised Rachel. It was culturally acceptable for the father to offer the bride a large gift for her wedding, thus Zilpah. That's why that's inserted there. So that's there because it shows that the actions of the father was him trying to honor his daughter. It was deceitful. It was tricky. It did not honor Jacob, but he was trying to honor his daughter, and that's why he did it. That's why that section is inserted there. Verse 25, in the morning, when Jacob woke up, behold, it was Leah. And Jacob said to Laban, "What is this that you've done to me? Did I not serve with you for Rachel? Why then have you deceived me?" Laban said, "It is not so done in our country to give the younger before the firstborn. Complete the week of this one, and we will give you the other also in return for serving me another 7 years." Jacob did so and completed her week. Then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel to be his wife. As expected, Jacob was not too happy with what happened. The timing here shows that something might have happened because he did not recognize who she was at nighttime. In ironies of all ironies, Jacob is angered that he had been deceived by Laban. Like Esau, his promised blessing was pulled right from under him. And Laban's response? Well, it's not right to give the younger the blessing before the firstborn. Man, oh man, does that not go back to what happened with Jacob and Esau when Jacob stole that birthright, stole that blessing from his big brother. Now, this doesn't get Laban off the hook, as he does deceive Jacob. However, Jacob does get a bitter taste of his own medicine. And in the end, Laban does offer new terms for Jacob. Once Jacob finishes the week of marriage with Leah, that he honors her, he will then give him Rachel if he does another 7 years. He sets his term for his daughter. Well, Jacob reluctantly agrees. So here we do see that Laban gave his female servant Bilhah to his daughter Rachel to be her servant. So Jacob went into Rachel also, and he loved Rachel more than Leah. Rachel is given to Jacob upon the agreement. Rachel is given a servant, so she is also honored. And while all seems that it ends well, the underlying unhappiness is laid out. Jacob still loves Rachel more than Leah, and problems will come from this. Well, you have another 7 years of service. This is a very quick, short narrative here. Jacob served Laban for another 7 years. He did what he was told to do. Time is passing. But notice here it's no longer familiar. It's no longer family. He served Laban. Laban is now the master, and Jacob is now the servant. So we have this last story we do have to cover quickly here, and that's the birth of Jacob's first set of boys. And that starts with Leah alone, then Leah and Rachel, and then the mandrakes, Leah and Rachel. We're only going to cover the first box here, and Pastor Ryan's going to cover the last two. But we do need to point out this narrative because it does focus on Leah a little bit. And Leah, she's a real tragic figure. It's really sad here. When the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb. But Rachel was barren, and Leah conceived and bore a son. And she called his name Reuben, for she said, "Because the Lord has looked upon my afflictions, for now my husband will love me." She conceived again and bore a son, and said, "Because the Lord has heard that I am hated, he has given me this son also." And she called his name Simeon. Again, she conceived and bore a son, and said, "Now this time my husband will be attached to me, because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore his name was called Levi. And she conceived again and bore a son, and said, "This time I will praise the Lord." Therefore she called his name Judah. Then she ceased bearing. So we go back and forth this text. We see that she kept having children. God saw the broken heart of Leah. He saw how she was hated by Jacob and Rachel. he had compassion for her and he opened his womb, but he kept Rachel barren, which is very important. He'll open her womb later, but again, the focus was on Leah here. The Lord was moved. He had compassion on her, and he helped her bear a son. 4 sons to get started, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, to get him going here. And every single time, this blessing that Leah received from God was tied to Jacob. Now my husband will love me. That was child 1. Child 2, he has given me this, so it's because I'm hated, right? The Lord has heard me, and he's given me sons because I'm hated. Number 3, now this time my husband will be attached to me. And then simply number 4, this time I will praise the Lord. It seemed like these things didn't continue to happen for her, that she was continuously disregarding the family, that Jacob's love for Rachel was far more important to him than that of Leah, which is very sad. And so we see this tension now developing between the 2 sisters that's going to carry over into a huge family for Jacob, into huge tensions that are going to go back and forth. But for me, I'm not going to cover that. Pastor Ryan's going to cover the giant family of Jacob and their movement back towards Beersheba in his interaction with Esau. So I know we've covered a lot. Thank you so much. But what's important here to end with is Jacob stole Esau's blessing. He then moved on, had an interaction with God, didn't fully change yet, didn't fully engage, but had an awareness that God was involved in this. Then he goes, he finds the love of his life. He himself was deceived. He received the wife he didn't want. He then had to commit and be abused, basically to be taken advantage of through another 70 years. He got 4 boys from it, whom he does love. We'll see that later in Scripture. But again, he didn't really love their mom, and his heart was truly for Rachel. And now we have this existing tension, what's going to pop up in the next half of Jacob's life. So with that said, Pastor Ryan's going to cover Jacob's wrestling match with God. Thank you so much for this time. I love you. I'm grateful for you. And I'll talk to you later. God bless.